We've been studying Emma for a few weeks now, but now we are going to turn our attention to the picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde. So I want to tell you a little bit about Wilde's background because some of the major events of his life um, do have some relevance for how we understand his writing. So he was born in Dublin. Lots of people think he's British, but really he's Irish. He was born in Dublin in 1854, and he was raised by upper middle class parents who were active in the Irish national movement. He had a pretty typical middle upper class education. When he went to college, he went to Trinity College in Oxford, and while there, he became well known for his wit and intelligence. After college, he went to London and he determined to be famous, and he did it by being the life of the party, being kind of a fashion plate, being somebody that people noticed. So you can see here, he liked to dress very fashionably. He liked to pose very fashionably. He just liked to be the person that people saw. One of the popular intellectual movements of the late 19th century, when Wilde was in college and then when he became a writer and an intellectual figure, was a movement called aestheticism. And it was perpetuated, it's the wrong word, it was popularized by a number of intellectuals of the time, one of whom was Walter Pater, who coined the phrase art for art's sake. And the theory behind that is that art should not have any function, it should not try to do anything, it simply is, and the beauty of it is sufficient for its existence. It does not need to have a moral purpose. People who followed this intellectual theory were known for being self-indulgent, known for being kind of graceful, known for living an artistic lifestyle. So here's a quote from Oscar Wilde that kind of explains some of his theories about art. You note that he says that nature is our creation, that one does not see anything until one sees its beauty. So to Wilde and to the people who espoused the aesthetic movement, art is something that truly is in the eye of the beholder. It is created when somebody receives its beauty. And that is going to have implications for how we understand Dorian Gray. Again, here he talks about how the work of art is something that exists in itself. An artist is not a craftsman, an artist is not a tradesman, an artist is not out to make something. So Wilde became well known for having these views, and he actually became a lecturer, a professional lecturer, talking about the aesthetic movement and about aesthetics. Gilbert and Sullivan, who wrote several famous operettas like The Pirates of Penzance, actually wrote one based on Oscar Wilde called Patience. So after he became a lecturer, he started to become an author, and he became famous for writing in the 1880s. He wrote a number of plays, one of which is Lady Windermere's Fan, which we see here. And in addition to the plays, he wrote Dorian Gray, and he wrote some short stories and fairy tales, which we'll get to in a minute. But here is his response to the audience on the opening night of Lady Windermere's Fan, and it explains his sense of humor and his writing style a little bit, and is a good preparation for the kind of humor, if you want to call it that he uses in Dorian Gray. I will warn you that Wilde has a very dry sense of humor. It's a very British sense of humor. It is not something that is common to American sensibilities, but you get a sense of it here, where he says, "Ladies and gentlemen, I have enjoyed this evening immensely. The actors have given us a charming rendering of a delightful play, and your appreciation has been most intelligent." Now, obviously here he's talking about his own play, so he is praising himself in the guise of praising the audience. So Wilde, as I said, wrote a number of plays, Lady Windermere's Fan, The Importance of Being Earnest, An Ideal Husband. He also wrote some fairy tales. The Selfish Giant, The Happy Prince are two that are well known today and that I have actually read to my children, so they're still in print and they're still popular. And in 1884, he got married and he had two young sons, and so he would read these fairy tales that he had written to them. In 1890, Wilde wrote the original version of The Picture of Dorian Gray, which was published in Lippincott's magazine. However, it was very controversial because one of the hallmarks of Wilde's writing is not what he says, but what he doesn't say. There's a lot that's implied, and people were scandalized by some of the things that were implied in the picture of Dorian Gray. If you've read the book yet now, or if when you sit down to read it, you will see that some of the relationships are questionable in nature, particularly to Victorian sensibilities. And as Dorian's adventures proceed throughout the novel, he becomes involved in some unsavory things. But the important thing about that is that we don't ever actually know specifically what Dorian does, except for a few things. So it's all about what is implied, what is not said, what we assume based on some of the evidence in the novel. And that's really what was the most scandalous to his readers. So Wilde was pressured to censor it, to tone it down. And his response to this criticism was to rewrite it into an 1891 version, which is the version that we're reading. It was expanded and revised. Some of the more scandalous stuff was toned down. And then he also added the preface that precedes the 1891 version, where he argues, among other things, that art is neither moral nor immoral. And this is in line with the aesthetic movement that I talked about just a couple of minutes ago. Here's where things get interesting. In 1891, Wilde began a homosexual affair with Lord Alfred Douglas, who was a young nobleman. At this time, homosexuality was not only considered immoral, it was also illegal. So when Douglas's father found out about this, he publicly accused Wilde of homosexual behavior. And Wilde then brought his accuser to trial for libel. In the course of the trial, portions of the picture of Dorian Gray were read out loud as evidence that Wilde was engaging in homosexual behavior. Throughout the trial, in an effort to defend himself, Wilde actually ended up admitting his homosexual behavior. So not only did he lose the trial to accuse somebody else of libel, but he was arrested, he was tried for, quote, immoral practices, and he was found guilty and sentenced to 2 years of hard labor. Not surprisingly, at this point, his wife and his sons left him, and Wilde ended up dying in 1900 in Paris after he got out of prison. So in addition to all of that, there's some social context to Dorian Gray that will help us understand what's going on. One thing is that in the time that Wilde lived in London, the population of London increased dramatically. In the 1870s, it was 4.7 million. By the 1890s, it was 7 million. So that is a huge population increase. And not surprisingly, that led to a great deal of poverty because there was overcrowding. There were people who couldn't get work. It was kind of a huge economic crisis. So in the picture of Dorian Gray, you will hear repeated references to the East End, which should always signal poverty to you, and to the West End, which should always signal wealth. Dorian and his compatriots belong to the West End. Some of the more unsavory elements of Dorian Gray, where Dorian goes to an opium den and things like that, those happen in the East End. And also pay attention to the places where Dorian and his friends talk about how they need to be of service to those who live in the East End. So at one point it is proposed that Dorian play the piano to entertain them and to give them a break from their sordid, awful lives. This is criticism on Wilde's part that the wealthy people of the West End aren't really caring about what's going on in the East End if they think that simply playing the piano for an hour or doing whatever small deeds that they're doing are really helping those people. Another idea that's going on among intellectuals at this time is modernism, which is the idea that institutions can't be trusted, that everything that we took as true and as authoritative can be questioned and can be challenged. This was not a popular idea among average people. In fact, Victorian culture is still quite conservative. But among the more bohemian intellectuals, this was starting to take hold, and it really did take root much, much more strongly around the time of World War I, which is about 20 years after this takes place. And finally, the aesthetic movement that I already talked about, so this idea of beauty and art being an ideal in itself. So I talked about the East End being equated with poverty. I just have a few pictures here of what life was like for the East End, people who lived in the East End in London. So we're talking tenements, overcrowding, lack of proper sanitation, health problems, extreme poverty, everything that you associate with poverty in the late 19th century. Contrasting with the East End is the West End, which signals wealth. So we're talking fox hunts and lavishly designed parlors and parties that last hours and hours and hours and excess of all kinds. You can see some of the elaborate designs here in the decor. Now, one thing I will add is that if you want to see more visually some of these contrasts, there's a movie of The Picture of Dorian Gray that came out just a few years ago. It does not stick to the plot of the book. It goes above and beyond anything scandalous that is implied in the book. It is rated R, and that is a good, perhaps tame rating for it. So if you would like to see it to get some idea of what Victorian decor and the contrast between these two cultures might have been, that's fine, but I would not use it as a substitution for the book, as it introduces new characters, new plot lines. It's quite different from the plot of the novel. But, you know, it's there, and it's interesting from an intellectual perspective to see how they redid the book when they made the movie. However, I have yet to see a movie version that sticks to the plot of the book, so just don't go there. I hope that this background is going to help you as you read The Picture of Dorian Gray. As always, if you have questions or anything, let me know. And I will note that the version of the novel that we're using for class has a lot of supplementary material. So it has some of the original criticisms of the original novel in it. It has some of Wilde's responses. It has the original shorter 1890 version of the novel. So if you're interested in doing that kind of comparison, you do have all of that information there, and you can take a look at it. And it is quite interesting. So I hope you enjoy the novel.